I'll share my screen here. So I thought about just providing a little bit of background about myself. Not too much, because I'm sure most people don't want to hear too much about me. And too much background, but just a little bit of context. So I grew up in Nebraska. That's fairly rare, I think, in San Francisco. There might be two or three of us in the whole city. Most people grow up in Nebraska, stay there. My folks are still back there. I think that's really important for a number of reasons. One of which is how we run our firm has a lot of same morals and a compass, if you will, as I was taught growing up in Nebraska. And what do I mean by that is hardworking, but also very honest. So it's rare a day, and certainly not a week goes by where we're referring potential clients to another attorney or clients to another attorney because we feel that we're not the best fit for the project. So it comes up often. We try to be very honest with folks. It happened yesterday as an example. A client who I've done work with before reached out and asked me if I could review a purchase agreement for a purchase of a property in Pennsylvania. And I told them, you're probably better off working with counsel who's licensed in Pennsylvania, who's based in Pennsylvania, because they may have different requirements. So we really kind of have that be a core tenet of the firm. Uh, Went to college in Iowa, got a master's degree back at Nebraska in political science. I worked for a congressman for a couple of years in Washington, D.C. Did a lot of budget issues, small business issues, tax issues before going to law school as a legislative aide. Uh, Went to law school at Georgetown. After that, I clerked for a couple of years. Once 1 year back in Nebraska State Supreme Court, 1 year down in St. Croix in the Caribbean. Decided, if I need to go to a big firm to kind of pay down the student debt, but if I kick the can on that responsibility, what would be worth it? And living on an island for a year came to mind. So I lived on St. Croix, clerking for a judge down there for a year. And then I worked for a law firm in New York City, corporate law, but very different clients, working for a lot of hedge funds, private equity funds. Now we're mostly focused on helping out small business owners and startups. And we started this firm back in 2010. So that's just a little bit of background about who I am, in case it's helpful. And the law firm as a whole, there's now 8 full-time attorneys. And so 4 of us are transactional attorneys doing a lot of entity formation work, a lot of contract drafting, negotiating, a lot of raising capital, some M&A work. One attorney does brand protection. So he files over 100 trademarks a year, protecting clients' brand names, the names of their restaurant, the names of their products. And then 3 attorneys are full-time business litigators. And so they do nothing but fight. And I don't like that. They love it. They love the chess match of it. They love the strategy of it. But that's how the firm's kind of divided up between transactional work, litigation work, and trademark work. And the idea is to serve as outside general counsel for small business owners when things come up and to be able to advise our clients. And just to flush that out a little bit, I thought it'd be helpful to provide a couple of case studies of the kind of work we do. One is eTip. So I was actually on the phone with him earlier today, the founder, and they provide digital tipping. So imagine you go to a hotel and you don't have $2, $5 to give to the valet there, to give to the bellhop. They'd be able to show you a QR code to scan to tip them digitally, right? So that's what they're working on. We've been with them through launch, and since then negotiated contracts with Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt, a number of Fortune 100 companies. All these case studies, I've gotten the client's permission, so don't worry, I'm not filing any sort of attorney-client confidentiality. It's also on our website, but kind of helping them negotiate that, and it's sometimes challenging because often we're representing the small dogs, right? And so the other party has a lot of leverage, so we have to be very strategic on the edits that we ask for, because a lot of them are going to say no, and you have a limited amount of negotiating capital, particularly with big dogs you're negotiating with. And so you have to be very strategic on what you ask for and really focus on the stuff that matters and don't get caught up on the stuff that doesn't matter. Another example client is Perfect Keto. They're doing a number of products. So, every time they roll out a product, they want trademark protection on the brand name to help make sure that if someone else comes along and has a similar product, that they have some more leverage and getting them to stop using a similar name. And it's not only US trademarks. We have trademark for clients around the world, EU and China, Central America. So really, as a client grows, often their intellectual property portfolio grows, including their trademark. Another example is Omakase Restaurant Group. Some of you may have eaten at a few of their restaurants. They have Several in San Francisco. So Dumpling Time is probably my favorite that I like going to. They also have several sushi spots, a steakhouse. And for those kind of clients, we do a lot of negotiating the commercial lease for their space. If they want to give equity to a key employee, drafting those documents, investment documents for when they're wanting to open up a new restaurant location. And of course, with any sort of restaurant business, you have a lot of employment law matters of all sorts, people coming and going and things going on. Let me put it that way. And then just one more, and then I'll dig into today's topic. The last one is Gyrotonic, and it's just an example of some of the mergers and acquisitions work we do. We help buy or sell about 15 companies a year, everything from a small comic book store, to a nail salon to big companies, eight-figure deals. So the size of the deal really ranges, but ideally it's protecting, if we're on the buy side, protecting the buyer coming in so they have a good idea of what they're getting themselves into, and hopefully there's less surprises once they take over the business. And on the sell side, making sure that the client gets paid out, and making sure that the business they built up has a kind of revenue for that client. For a lot of those clients, that's really their nest egg. They've been spent years building up their business, and they have an exit, and they want to make sure that they get paid out on it. So those are just kind of a few examples to flesh out some of the work that the firm does. The stuff that we're really going to focus in on today, and by all means, if people have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I get excited, I start going, right? So, but we're going to be talking about whether or not it makes sense to have your business taxed as an S corporation instead of continuing to be a sole proprietorship. We help set up over 50 legal entities a year. I've done hundreds of legal entities. So this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time on calls with CPAs, and a lot of time really helping the client understand the cost benefit analysis of, what are the benefits of having an S corporation? What are the costs? And at what point does that scale switch where it makes more sense for the client to be an S corporation for the business than a sole proprietorship? So a little bit about a professional corporation. So, therapists are different. The state of California has decided that there's certain professions that should not be allowed to be a normal general corporation, and that those types of professional corporations have additional rules and regulations to them. And therapists are one of those industries where they come in addition to lawyers, doctors. They say, you know what, there should be special rules for people in this profession to own stock and equity in that type of company because there's additional guidelines to it, right? And so, for example, some additional requirements for a professional corporation in California for a therapy business is that you have naming restrictions. There's certain words that you have to use, certain words you can't use in the name of the professional corporation for a therapy practice. There's restrictions on who could be officer of the corporation, who could be a board of director of the corporation. So there's additional requirements for having a corporation in California. I think there's always drawbacks to using an online platform for setting up an entity, but particularly if you're looking to set one up as a therapist, I think there's more benefit to working with an attorney because you have those additional requirements you have to be mindful of. And if you don't do it right, if you file the wrong set of articles of incorporation, for example, to form the corporation, you have to go back and you have to, do it over. You have to dissolve the general corporation. You still have to file a tax return for that year for that general corporation. So it can be a real mess. So I think, really thinking about working with counsel, forming any entity, but professionally, particularly with a professional corporation, there's even more wrinkles that you have to be aware of when setting up that legal entity. So what are the advantages of a professional corporation? I think there's really a few different advantages. The biggest one is taxes. And for most of our clients to set up a legal entity for an S corporation, taxes is not only the main benefit, but everything else is icing on the cake. And so they meet with their CPA in the springtime, and they're a sole proprietorship, and they sit down, and the CPA says, you owe all this additional taxes, right? And the client thinks, that's a lot of money in taxes. Is there anything I can do? Can I do something different than being a sole proprietorship to perhaps save some money the next time we sit down the next year on the tax liability from my business? And we get a lot of referrals from CPAs. And the reason why is that for some of them, they say, once you have a certain amount of net profits for the business, there may be enough tax savings from the business to offset the additional costs of being an S corporation. And why is that? Like, how does that work? The way that it works is that if you're a sole proprietorship right now, you've gotten used to being not only the employee if you're working for somebody else, but also the employer. You're both, right? If you're sole proprietorship. And as such, you're paying both sides of the taxes for employment taxes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. You add those three things up, it's about 15.3%. So before you even get to any sort of state and federal income tax liability, right off the top for about the first 150,000 or so, 15.3% to employment taxes. Social Security drops off at some point. Medicare, Medicaid though continues indefinitely, right? So whereas if you set up an S corporation, the way that changes the tax ball game is that you become a W-2 employee of your S corporation. You set a reasonable salary for yourself. You get that reasonable salary paid off to you, typically monthly, every month, and you continue to pay employment taxes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, on that reasonable salary, right? But the amount of net profits above your reasonable salary can be paid out to you as a distribution payment as a shareholder of that S corporation. And because it's paid out to you as a distribution payment, it's not subject to employment taxes. It's not subject to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid taxes. So on those distribution payment amounts, you're saving 15.3% on the first large chunk of income that's coming out of the business, right? And so just to flesh this out a little bit, to make it a little more concrete, give an example of a business that's making $100,000 a year. I'll use nice round numbers. There's a reason I'm an attorney. I'm not good at math, so I'll use a nice round number of $100,000 a year. What matters in this situation, much more than the gross from the business, is the net profits, right? So right now, if you're a sole proprietorship and you're netting $100,000 a year, you're paying roughly $15,000, 15.3% Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid before you get to any sort of state and federal income tax. You layer on state and federal income tax. Next thing you know, your effective tax rate, particularly in California, might be closer to 50%, right? A very large tax bill. So what would forming a corporation that elects to be taxed as an S corporation, how would that change the tax ball game for you? Well, you would set a reasonable salary for yourself. What is that? It really varies. It varies depending on your profession. It varies depending on your CPA. We work with dozens of CPAs. I see all kinds of recommendations across the board in terms of the amount of reasonable salary they recommend to their clients. And lastly, it depends on your risk tolerance. And so for reasons I'll explain, the lower you set that reasonable salary, the more tax savings you have. But presumably at some point, if you set it way too low, perhaps that creates a more of a potential audit issue for you, right? So those are the factors that go into setting a reasonable salary. I'll use myself as an example. I started out as a sole proprietorship in 2010. 2012, I had enough net profits coming in the business that I elected to be taxed as an S corporation instead of a sole proprietorship. I set my initial reasonable salary at $60,000 a year. If $100,000 net was coming in the business, I paid 15.3% in employment taxes on my $60,000 reasonable salary. But the $40,000 net, the difference between the $100,000 total minus $60,000 salary, that $40,000 difference paid out to me as a distribution payment from the corporation. And as such, it wasn't subject to employment taxes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So $40,000 saving 15.3% in taxes, saving roughly $6,000 a year with those numbers, right, in taxes. There's going to be costs involved that we'll talk about, but in that hypothetical, there's be more tax savings than there would be costs in maintaining the S corporation. And of course, as the net profits go up from that S corporation, the amount of money that you're saving on employment taxes goes up as well. That's a lot. I can kind of break it down more if people have questions once we get through this. Some other things to be thinking about, back to the point that, therapists are treated differently in the state of California as are other professional service businesses, is that, you get liability protection from your professional corporation from lawsuits that are not related to your professional services, right? So, for example, you have an employee, you fire that employee sues you for wrongful termination, you lose that lawsuit for wrongful termination. You get that protection, that liability protection to protect your personal assets from that business activity that's going on, provided if the professional corporation was properly set up and properly maintained. Another good example is slip and falls, right? I don't want to jinx everybody today, right, with all these hypotheticals about how you can be sued. But a patient comes into your office, it's a rainy day, they slip and fall, they hurt themselves, they sue the company for negligence, saying, hey, you knew it was a rainy day, the floor was wet for over an hour, you should have had that dried and cleaned up. If you didn't, I wouldn't have suffered this damages. Well, if they win that lawsuit, the professional corporation helps protect your personal assets because it's not related to your professional services. However, the professional corporation does not protect you for your professional services, not only for therapists, but also for lawyers, right? So, it doesn't provide any liability protection in that regard. You have to rely on contracts with your clients. You have to rely on insurance on behalf of your business. And then lastly, another reason why sometimes people have us set up legal entities, including but not limited to corporations, is that they sometimes view it as almost a marketing expense. And what I mean by that is that, particularly if they're doing business with larger companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, they feel that if they're entering into a contract with those bigger players on behalf of ABC Incorporated instead of on behalf of Doug Bend, that those types of clients, particularly the bigger clients, might take them more seriously, might view them more as a real business. And so they almost view it as a marketing expense to be a corporation and to be able to market themselves and sign contracts on behalf of that corporation. For most of our clients, though, it's really about the taxes, right? It's really about the tax savings and the liability protection, and the marketing, if you will, is just icing on the cake. So I just see a comment here from Mark talking about how they feel 70K is a reasonable salary for financial advisor trainees. So that's just kind of an example, and it's things that we've seen other clients do, right? So sometimes they'll go to salary.com, for example, and they'll do a search for their type of profession, their amount of experience, and they'll see what salary.com says the median amount is. And maybe they email that to their CPA, they email it to me saying, hey, I'm setting my initial reasonable salary at $70,000 a year. This is why I'm setting it at that amount. And presumably, if there's ever an audit, knock on wood, you could show that as documentation and part of your case to IRS saying, this is what we set it at. We kind of base it on this objective third-party criteria into setting what that reasonable salary would be for my profession, given my experience level. Over time, my W-2 salary has gone up. My CPA has advised me that my W-2 salary at a minimum should be higher than my highest paid W-2 employee. So over time, mine has gone up much more than what it was set initially at $60,000. But it really varies across the board. Let's see here. So we talked a little bit about some of the drawbacks of professional corporations. So, on the pro side, you have potential tax savings, you have some liability protection, you have maybe some marketing, perhaps, depending on who you're doing business with. What's the other side of the equation we're looking at, right? So, the other side of the equation is that when you set up an S corporation, you're going to have roughly, $3,000 to $4,000 in additional expenses for your business. And so you need to have enough net profits that you can save 15.3% on to offset those additional $3,000 to $4,000 a year in expenses to have some net tax savings to make this thing worthwhile, right? And what are those additional expenses? There's three. So the first one is that California has an annual franchise tax for the privilege of doing business in the state of California as a legal entity. I believe it's the initial payment, the lowest payment. I think it's the highest in the country. It's $800 minimum every year, regardless of whether or not you're using that legal entity. As long as it's active with the Secretary of State's office, you have to pay at least $800 a year in franchise taxes. So that's where some of that, $3,000 to $4,000 a year is coming from. The second expense is that you have to pay your CPA to file a separate corporate tax return, and that varies CPA to CPA. Just as an example, my CPA charges me about $2,500 a year. just depending on really how many questions I ask, how high maintenance I am, right? But just for purposes of discussion, $2,500 a year to file a separate corporate tax return every year. So 800 plus 2,500, that gets us at 3,200. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, you have to run payroll on yourself. You're a W-2 employee. So you have to, engage ADP, Paychecks. We use Gusto, and that varies by service provider. Gusto charges about $70 a month. So just kind of rounding up to that, about another $1,000. So that's where I'm getting this number of about $3,000 to $4,000 a year in additional expenses you're going to be incurring on your business by having an S corporation that you do not currently have. Second item, one of the really great things about being a sole proprietorship is that it's easy, right? You get your city business license. Maybe you file a fictitious business name statement because you have a DBA. Maybe get an EIN. Don't have to, but maybe get an EIN with the IRS to help keep your Social Security number private. Then you're done, right? You renew your city business license every year. You renew your fictitious business name statement for your DBA if you have one every 5 years, but relatively easy to set up and to maintain. When you form a corporation, there are additional requirements that you have to do. I don't think that they're significant. Maybe that's because this is what I do for a living, right? But I think it's particularly after you do it, 1 or 2 years, maybe it takes you a half an hour to an hour a year, and what are those requirements? So there's two. The first one is that you're required to file with the Secretary of State's office in California every year what's called a statement of information, right? And that statement of information says, hey, this is our address for the corporation. This is who is on the board of directors. This is who is the president, secretary, and treasurer of our corporation. So you have to file that every year, but it's a one-page filing, so it's not very long. And if nothing has changed from the prior year, you check a box saying nothing's changed, right? So fairly minimal, $25 filing fee. So I don't think that's a big obligation filing that every year. The second obligation is you're required to have a annual shareholders meeting and an annual board of directors meeting or a written consent in lieu of a meeting, right? The vast majority of our clients do a written consent in lieu of a meeting because it doesn't change that much year to year, right? So page 1, shareholders consent. Shareholders consent to electing, guess who they're going to elect to the board of directors? You, right? Most likely, you're the only shareholder, you're electing yourself to the board of directors, right? That doesn't change much year to year besides the date. Next page, board of directors consent. Who is the board electing to be the president, secretary, and treasurer for the upcoming year? You, probably you, right? So that doesn't change much year to year. Sometimes clients will have us put in additional resolutions if they want to document something that their CPA feels is important, such as a new office lease, the company renting a car, things of that nature. But the bulk of that, annual consent changes, not that much year to year. And so once you've done it for, 1 or 2 years, I really don't think it takes more than half an hour to do that. So there are additional requirements, but we're not talking about throwing a shareholders meeting for Disney, right? Or Berkshire Hathaway. I'm from Omaha, I'm a fan of Warren Buffett. You're not talking about this big shareholders meeting. It doesn't have to be that, right? It could be a written consent in lieu of a meeting just to document those things. And then lastly, as I mentioned, for tax reasons, you have to pay yourself a reasonable salary as a W-2 employee. And so every month you're paying that reasonable salary out from the corporation on a monthly basis. Whereas a sole proprietorship, you may not be making monthly payments out to yourself. So I think we covered a little bit of some of the other drawbacks of professional corporation. There's just a couple more I wanted to mention. The first one is that when you're a professional corporation, you are a W-2 employee of your own professional corporation. And as such, you have to pay unemployment taxes. The state of California, being a W-2 employee, right? And that rate varies. It varies on how the general fund is doing, and it varies on your business. And so if you're an early business, the tax is higher, 5 to 6%. Over time, if you're not laying people off that are claiming unemployment benefits, it goes down over time, right? But that's an additional expense. The good news is that, if you go on paternity leave, maternity leave, things of that nature, you're eligible, right? So I have 2 young kids. Each time I had a young kid, I took paternity leave, and the state of California paid me paternity leave benefits just as if I was a W-2 employee of anybody else, right? So you're paying more in, but perhaps depending on what your life circumstances are, you may be getting some of that money back. And then I think, the last thing is that if it's just you, the last bullet point is moot. But if you have other co-owners and you're looking, and there's movement, right? And eventually there always is someone leaving, someone coming, doing that documentation of who owns what amount of equity, the company repurchasing the equity. There is some additional paperwork that you would need to do for that. But I think for a lot of people that are listening to this, a lot of them are sole service providers, or they're the sole equity owner in their firm. So I think that's probably less of an issue for these types of businesses than perhaps some other types of corporations. So lastly, I think this is the last slide here. So it really, boils down to this. If you have another therapist coming in, what is the complications, right? If you have more than one owner of your professional corporations, there's really three things that you'd have to keep in mind. One, like, how are you splitting the profits? Is it 50-50, or is someone generating a lot more revenue, so they should be getting more than net profits for the business? Do they have a bigger book of business? Have they been practicing longer? What is a fair split in equity, and which turns into the proportionate distribution of shareholder payments from the corporation? Next, like, how will decisions be made? If it's owned 50-50, there's deadlock. If one person wants to go one way, one person wants to go the other way, there's deadlock. Nothing happens, right? So do you want somebody to have a little more equity, so push comes to shove, they're the tie-breaking vote? Do you want to designate a third person to have a little bit of equity to be the tie-breaking vote? But thinking through about how decisions would be made for your corporation. And then lastly, what happens when people become permanently disabled, or when they die, right? And we often see this less for a brand new professional corporation because the business doesn't have that much value. But if it's been around for a while, doing that long-term planning of maybe putting in a buy-sell agreement to have insurance to buy somebody out when they pass away. There's some considerations you'd be thinking about for when someone is no longer part of the corporation. This is the last slide. And so I think, really what I recommend people do is, set a Google Calendar alert, or, Microsoft Office, whatever you use, right? Set a calendar alert every year for about December 1st. And what is that calendar alert? The calendar alert is to do a check-in, where if you are not at sufficient net profits now, to look at your books for that year, to think, okay, like, I wasn't there last year or this year, but this upcoming year, given how the business is trending, I think I'm going to have enough net profits to have enough tax savings to offset the additional 4K in costs we talked about, and then some, right? And then some to make it worthwhile. So I think setting a Google alert every year to kind of check in to see, and then, of the 50 plus entities we form every year, we form 30 plus on January 1st. And the reason we do so many on January 1st is that as we get closer and closer to the end of the year, more and more clients say, do I really want to set this up for 2025? Or do I want to set it up for January 1st, 2026 moving forward, so I don't incur those costs for 2025? Most of those costs are calendar year costs, the tax return, the franchise tax. They don't prorate it, right? And so I think, thinking about it at the end of the year for the upcoming year makes a lot of sense. So you have a full year of benefit for the first year that you form the corporation. And by all means, a good CPA should be able to sit down with you and say, 2024, you were a sole proprietorship. This was your tax liability. If you had been an S corporation instead, this would have been your tax liability. I've seen those types of memos, right? The side-by-side comparison. So by all means, check in with your CPA to see if they have a recommendation. So I think with that, I know when I start to get hoarse, I've been talking too much. But by all means, happy to answer any questions people might have.
I have a question, Doug.
Great.
So I've been working with my CPA, and although I am an LLC, she was like, let's go ahead and file you as an S Corp. But my question goes to one of the slides that you had there regarding keeping annual minutes. Because I asked the CPA, and I know she's not the expert in it, you probably are, but I said, hey, do I need to keep these annual minutes because I'm filing as an S Corp? And she's like, you're filing as an S Corp, Alice, you are an LLC.
Yeah.
She's like, so you need to just follow LLC rules. You don't need to follow S Corp rules because we're using the tax bracket for that. So is that correct?
She's right. That is correct. And so, as a therapist, the therapist can't be an LLC. The state of California says, hey, for your therapy business, you can't be an LLC. That's off the board. That's not an option. But for other types of businesses, one of the great things about an LLC is its tax flexibility. And so you can the default is that an LLC is taxed as a sole proprietor. You can be taxed as a sole proprietor, your LLC can indefinitely forever, or in a subsequent tax year, you can make an S Corp tax election to have your LLC instead taxed as an S corporation. And when you do so, the analysis we just went through, exactly the same, right? You file the exact same form with the IRS, Form 2553, to elect to have an LLC taxed as an S corporation as you do for a corporation to be taxed as an S corporation. But that tax election is purely a tax election. You're still underlying that. You're still an LLC. And so you do not have those additional obligations we talked about, the annual statement of information, the annual board and shareholders consent. You don't have that. LLCs still have to file a statement of information every other year, right? But it's not every year.
I'm still also though an employee because they told me you need to be an
Mhm.
employee, so I had to switch all that.
Yeah, exactly the same, right? So, when you made that S corp tax election, to get the tax benefits, you become a W-2 employee of your own company. It seems a little weird, but that's that's the way it works, right? And so you're presumably running payroll on yourself as a W-2 employee with, the payroll processing company is withholding those those employment taxes, state and federal income tax. But then you have net profits above that reasonable salary that you set for yourself that can be paid out to you as a distribution payment. And that's where the tax savings are, unemployment taxes, right? That amount that's above your reasonable salary.
Thanks, Doug.
Well, if that's it, I'll stop talking. By all means, you're welcome to reach out. I don't charge for any sort of initial consultation. If you want to have a call with me, regardless of whether it's not, whether it's about setting up an entity, whether it makes sense for your business or anything else, I'm happy to chat with you. And if I don't know what I'm talking about, I'll let you know and try to find you the right resource that is. And I think for a lot of businesses, it's more of a question of when than if, right? It's more of a question of when will that business have sufficient net profits where the S corporate election makes sense. And we've advised people that maybe it's not time. Maybe it's not time. They come back 1 or 2 years later as the business gains traction and takes off, and then they make that S corp jump at that point.
So I have a question on that. So basically, if somebody's starting their business, um, you would recommend starting a sole proprietorship and then eventually see if you move into an S corp if you make enough money.
I'll give a lawyer answer, and then I'll explain my lawyer answer, right? So my lawyer answer, it depends. Right? That's what lawyers like to say. It depends, right? And it depends on this. Most of the time, particularly for therapists, that's correct. You start as a sole proprietorship. That's the legal default. City of San Francisco, you're supposed to register within, if you're doing at least 7 days of business a year in the city, so a very low threshold. So sole proprietorship makes sense for a lot of therapists. The reason I say it depends is that we have some clients that start with a big book of business. They start saying, hey, look, like I'm well above that reasonable salary threshold right out of the gate, and I know that. And so for those folks, sometimes they start the S corporation from day one. Well, if folks don't have anything else, I'll stop. I'll stop the share here, and I'll also, stop the clock. I just want to thank everybody for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and please reach out if I can be of any help.
Thank you, Doug. That was